Imagine being an English soldier in 1066, standing at a river crossing, watching a single Viking warrior blocking a narrow bridge. For 250 years, Vikings have been the nightmare of England. They've burned your monasteries, enslaved your people, conquered half your kingdom, and no English army has ever truly stopped them. Now this giant stands alone with a war axe, and he's already killed 20 of your comrades. Bodies pile at his feet. The bridge runs red with English blood. But today is different. Today England has had enough. This is the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where one Viking axeman killed 40 Englishmen before being speared through the bridge from below, and where 6,000 Vikings met their end in one afternoon of slaughter that finally ended the Viking Age forever. The Vikings had been terrorizing England since 793, when they first raided Lindisfarne Monastery. For over 2 centuries, wave after wave of Norse raiders had struck English shores. They came in their longships, fast and deadly, appearing without warning to burn, kill, and enslave. They had conquered the Danelaw, ruled York, extracted tribute from English kings, and shaped the very language and culture of England through violence. English mothers used Vikings as threats to scare children. English kings paid enormous fortunes in Danegeld to buy temporary peace. The Vikings seemed unstoppable, a permanent threat that England simply had to endure. But in 1066, everything would change in a single day of brutal combat. Harald Hardrada was the living embodiment of Viking terror. At 6'5", he towered over other men in an age when the average height was 5'6". He was 51 years old in 1066, but age had only made him more dangerous. For 40 years, he had been killing professionally. He had fought as a mercenary in Russia, commanded the Varangian Guard, protecting the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople, crushed rebellions across the Mediterranean, and seized the throne of Norway through civil war. His body was covered in scars from dozens of battles. His nickname Hardrada meant hard ruler or ruthless, and every kingdom in Europe knew his reputation. When he decided to add England to his conquests, people didn't laugh. They prepared for war. Harold's claim to England was questionable, but backed by 15,000 warriors. He argued he had inherited rights to the English throne through complicated treaties between previous kings. But the real reason was simpler. England was rich, divided, and vulnerable. King Edward the Confessor had died in January without a clear heir. 3 men claimed the throne. Harold Godwinson had been crowned king immediately with the support of the English nobles. William of Normandy claimed Edward had promised him the crown, and Harald Hardrada wanted it because he was strong enough to take it. Harold found an ally in Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own exiled brother, who hated his sibling and wanted revenge. Together, they assembled 300 longships, the largest Viking invasion fleet in decades. The invasion fleet sailed from Norway in September 1066, carrying 15,000 Vikings to England's doom or glory. They landed in northern England and immediately began doing what Vikings had done for 250 years. They raided, burned, and killed. Villages along the coast were destroyed. The countryside was terrorized. Local English earls, Edwin and Morcar, gathered their northern armies to stop the invasion before it could spread south. On September 20th at Fulford, just outside York, they met Harold's Vikings in battle. The result was catastrophic for England. The Vikings crushed the English army, killing thousands and scattering the survivors. It was the same story England had seen for centuries. Vikings arrive, Vikings win, English die. York surrendered immediately after Fulford. The city that had once been the capital of the Viking kingdom of Jorvik opened its gates without further resistance. Harald Hardrada demanded hostages, supplies, and submission, and the city gave him everything. The Vikings settled in to enjoy their victory, confident that the pattern would continue. They had defeated the northern English armies. King Harold Godwinson was in the south, preparing to face William of Normandy. The Vikings probably assumed Harold would pay them tribute or negotiate a partition of England, just as English kings had done for generations. They had no idea that this time would be different, that this English king would refuse to accept Viking conquest as inevitable. King Harold Godwinson was in London when news reached him that Vikings had crushed his northern army and taken York. He was already preparing to face a Norman invasion from the south. Now his own brother was invading from the north with the most feared Viking in Europe, and they had just won a major victory. Most kings would have despaired, would have tried to negotiate, would have bought time with gold. Harold did something unprecedented. He decided to destroy the Vikings immediately, completely and permanently. He gathered his housecarls, his elite professional warriors, and began a forced march that would cover 185 miles in 4 days. He was going to hit the Vikings before they knew he was coming. The march from London to York was brutal beyond belief. 185 miles in 4 days meant averaging over 40 miles per day while carrying weapons, armor, and supplies. Modern soldiers in good conditions struggled to maintain 30 miles a day. Harold's men did it in September heat, through rough medieval roads, in full combat gear. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Some died from heat stroke on the road. Stragglers fell behind and had to catch up. But Harold pushed them mercilessly because he understood that speed was his only advantage. If Harald Hardrada had time to prepare proper defences, to call in more Vikings from the ships, to organise the conquest of northern England, he would be nearly impossible to defeat. But if Harold could surprise him, catch the Vikings scattered and unprepared, he could win. It was a desperate gamble. Harald Hardrada had no idea the English king was coming. After the victory at Fulford, the Vikings had moved to Stamford Bridge, a village 7 miles east of York, to collect the hostages and supplies the city had promised. The location was chosen because it was a convenient meeting point, with a bridge crossing the River Derwent, where representatives from York could easily reach the Viking camp. September 25th was a beautiful day, unseasonably hot for northern England. The sun was bright, the temperature climbing. The Vikings, who had been marching and fighting in their heavy armor for weeks, made a decision that seemed reasonable in the moment. They left most of their armor and weapons at the ships anchored at Rickle, 12 miles away. Why wear 70 pounds of chainmail on a hot day when you're just collecting tribute from a defeated city? When Harold's English army appeared on the hills above Stamford Bridge on the morning of September 25th, the Vikings were lounging in the sun. Some were swimming in the river, others were eating breakfast. Many had their armor stacked nearby but weren't wearing it. Weapons were close at hand, but not in hand. They were warriors taking a break after victory, confident in their dominance, completely unprepared for battle. Then they looked up and saw thousands of English warriors in full armor marching down the road toward them. The shock must have been incredible. The English king was supposed to be 200 miles away in London. Instead, he was here now, with an army ready to fight. The Vikings scrambled for their weapons. Harald Hardrada immediately understood the catastrophe unfolding. He was a veteran of 40 years of warfare, and he knew his army was in the worst possible position. Scattered, mostly unarmored, divided by a river, with their main equipment 12 miles away at the ships. He started shouting orders, trying to organize chaos into something resembling a fighting formation. He sent riders galloping toward Rickle to bring reinforcements and armor, but that was a 12-mile ride each way through September heat. The riders wouldn't return for hours. Harold had to delay the English somehow, had to buy time for his scattered forces to arm themselves and form a shield wall. His eyes went to the bridge crossing the River Derwent. It was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men to walk side by side, a perfect bottleneck that a few men could defend. The tactical situation demanded sacrifice. Harald Hardrada pulled together the Vikings, who were on the west side of the river with him, and formed a hasty shield wall on the far side of the bridge. These men would be the main defensive line if the Vikings could organize one. But first, the English had to cross that bridge, and Harald needed someone to hold it long enough for the rest of his army to prepare. Historical sources don't record the bridge defender's name, but they agree he volunteered or was ordered to take the bridge alone. He was one of Harald's housecarls, his personal bodyguard, a professional warrior who had survived decades of combat. He had no armor because there had been no time. He carried only his war axe, a Danish axe with a 3-foot handle and a crescent blade designed to kill armored men. He walked out onto the narrow wooden bridge and took his stand. The English army approached the bridge, expecting to storm across and slaughter the unprepared Vikings on the other side. Then they saw the lone Viking standing in the middle of the bridge, blocking their path. He was huge, over 6 feet tall, heavily muscled, holding that massive axe casually like it weighed nothing. He looked at the English army, thousands of men, and he didn't move. He dared them to try crossing. The English commanders probably thought he was insane. One unarmored man against an army. They ordered their soldiers forward. What happened next became legend. The first English soldier who stepped onto that bridge to fight the Viking died before he could raise his weapon. The axe moved in a blur, a horizontal strike that caught the Englishman in the chest and threw him off the bridge into the river below. The killing began in earnest. English soldiers charged onto the bridge 2 and 3 at a time, trying to overwhelm the Viking with numbers, but the bridge was too narrow for them to use their advantage. They could only come at him in single file, where the fight became about individual skill, strength, and weapon reach. The Viking had all three. His Danish axe had longer reach than English swords. He could strike from farther away, could hit them before they could hit him. Each swing of that axe killed or crippled. He split shields in half, sheared through helmets, severed limbs, bodies piled up on the bridge. When they threatened to block his movement, he kicked them into the river. The water below turned red with English blood. 10 English soldiers died, then 20, then 30. The Viking fought in a state of berserker rage, the legendary Norse battle fury that made men immune to pain and fear. Arrows shot at him were dodged or knocked aside. Spears thrust at him were parried with the axe handle. Swords that managed to hit him left cuts but didn't slow him down. He was bleeding from multiple wounds but didn't seem to notice or care. Behind him, the Vikings on the eastern bank were using this precious bought time to arm themselves and form some kind of defensive line. Every minute the bridge defender held was another minute for his comrades to prepare. Every English death was delaying the inevitable assault. The Viking knew he was going to die on that bridge, but he was going to make it cost the English everything he could. The English commanders tried everything. They sent their best fighters, veteran housecarls in full mail armor who had fought in dozens of battles. The Viking killed them with strikes that found gaps in armor or simply smashed through with pure force. They tried coordinated attacks with multiple soldiers timing their strikes. The narrow bridge made coordination impossible, and the Viking killed them one by one. They tried to rush him with shields locked, pushing forward through sheer mass. The axe hooked shields and pulled them aside, exposing the men behind. An hour passed. The bridge ran red. 40 English soldiers lay dead, and the Vikings still stood. The English army was growing desperate and angry. One man was stopping thousands, and English pride couldn't accept it. Finally, an English soldier had a different idea. If they couldn't cross over the bridge, maybe they could attack from under it. The English found a small boat or a barrel. Accounts vary in the chronicles. A brave soldier got inside with a long spear and had his comrades push him into the river upstream of the bridge. The current carried him downstream, floating under the wooden bridge where the Vikings stood above, still fighting off the latest attack from the front. The soldier in the boat found the gaps between the wooden planks and thrust his spear upward blindly through the bridge. The spear point caught the Viking defender in the groin or lower abdomen, driving deep into his body. The wound was mortal. The Viking collapsed on the bridge, his blood dripping through the planks onto the soldier below. He had held alone for over an hour, killed 40 men, and given his army precious time. Then he died without ever seeing the enemy who killed him. The English army poured across the bridge the moment the defender fell. They were angry, humiliated by the delay, and ready to take revenge on the Vikings waiting on the other side. They formed up on the eastern bank and charged the hastily prepared Viking shield wall. The collision of the two armies was tremendous. The sound of shields and weapons crashing together could be heard for miles. But the Vikings were at a massive disadvantage. Most still had no armor, fighting in tunics and trousers against fully armored English housecarls. They had courage and desperation, but the English had protection and momentum. When the shield walls met, English weapons found Viking flesh easily, while Viking weapons skidded off English mail. Harald Hardrada fought in the front rank like he had for 40 years. At 6'5", he towered above the battle, impossible to miss, his sword rising and falling as he killed English soldiers. He was trying to hold the shield wall together through sheer force of will and personal example. If the line held long enough, reinforcements would arrive from the ships with armor and fresh warriors. But the line was buckling. Too many Vikings were dying. The weight of English numbers and armor was telling. Men were falling with wounds that armor would have stopped. The shield wall was beginning to break in places. Harald was everywhere, plugging gaps, rallying his men, killing enemies. Then an English arrow hit him in the throat. The giant Viking king clutched at the arrow shaft, staggered, and fell. The most feared Viking in Europe died in an English field from a lucky shot. Harald's death should have broken the Viking army immediately, but these were professional warriors who had followed him for years. They reformed around the fallen king's body and kept fighting. Tostig Godwinson, Harald's exiled brother who had brought the Vikings to England, took command and tried to stabilize the collapsing situation. King Harald, fighting his own brother on the battlefield, reportedly rode forward under a flag of truce and offered Tostig a pardon. He could have his earldom back, could rejoin the English side if he surrendered now. Tostig asked what Harald Hardrada would receive if the Vikings surrendered. Harald answered that he would give Harald 6 feet of English ground for a grave, or perhaps 7 feet, since he was taller than most men. The negotiations ended, the fratricide continued. The Viking reinforcements finally arrived from Rickhall in the early afternoon, hundreds of warriors who had force-marched 12 miles in full armor, carrying weapons and shields. They were exhausted from the run, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat from wearing mail in the September heat. But they were fresh fighters, fully armored, and ready to kill. They crashed into the English lines, and the momentum of the battle shifted. Suddenly, the Vikings had warriors who could stand against English weapons, whose armor turned English blades. The fighting became even more brutal as fresh Vikings engaged exhausted English soldiers. For a time it seemed the battle might turn, but there were only a few hundred reinforcements against thousands of English. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and their king was already dead. They were delaying the inevitable. The Viking shield wall finally shattered in the late afternoon. Exhaustion, casualties, and overwhelming English numbers broke what armor and courage had held together. Once the wall broke, the massacre began. Vikings without armor tried to run and were hunted down by English cavalry. Small groups formed defensive circles and fought to the death where they stood. Some tried to surrender, but were killed anyway. The English were too angry, too exhausted, had lost too many friends to show mercy. The killing spread across the fields around Stamford Bridge. Vikings who fled toward the ships were cut down on the roads. Groups that made stands in the nearby woods were surrounded and slaughtered. The afternoon sun shone down on systematic butchery. Tostig Godwinson died in the fighting, cut down by English soldiers who may or may not have known they were killing their king's brother. Harald Hardrada's son Olaf fought desperately trying to rally the Vikings, But there was nothing to rally around anymore. The army was broken, scattered, dying. The River Derwent became choked with bodies. Vikings jumped in trying to escape and drowned in their armor, or were shot by English archers on the banks. Some bodies floated downstream. Others piled up where the current slowed. Medieval chroniclers claimed the bodies were so thick in some places that you could cross the river walking on corpses without getting wet. Whether literally true or not, the image captured the scale of the slaughter. English soldiers collapsed where they stood when the fighting finally ended. They had marched 185 miles in 4 days, and then fought for hours in armor in the September heat. Some simply fell unconscious from exhaustion. Others lay down and couldn't get back up. A few died from heat stroke even after the battle ended. Their bodies pushed beyond endurance. They had won a complete and total victory, but the cost in exhaustion was extreme. Harald's housecarls, his elite warriors, had suffered significant casualties. These professional soldiers were irreplaceable, each one worth 10 ordinary soldiers. Harald would desperately need every one of them in 3 weeks when William of Normandy landed. But today they had done the impossible. They had destroyed a Viking invasion completely. The counting of the Viking dead took days and was never truly complete. Over 6,000 Vikings had died at Stamford Bridge. The exact number was impossible to determine because bodies were scattered across miles of countryside and many had washed away in the river. But the evidence was overwhelming. Every Viking leader of importance had fallen. Harald Hardrada, Tostig Godwinson, dozens of jarls and famous warriors whose names were known across Scandinavia. The survivors numbered perhaps 1,000 at most, probably fewer. When they limped back to the longships at recall, 300 vessels waited at anchor. The survivors needed only 24 ships to carry everyone home. That simple statistic told the story of complete annihilation. 300 ships had brought conquest. 24 ships carried home the shattered remnants. The aftermath was silence and smoke. The fields around Stamford Bridge were covered with Viking dead. Carrion birds circled overhead in massive flocks. The local English began the grim work of burying thousands of bodies before disease spread. Some Vikings were given proper burials. Most were dumped in mass graves. The English collected weapons and armor from the dead, valuable equipment that would be redistributed to English soldiers. Broken shields, shattered swords and blood-stained mail littered the battlefield for weeks. The village of Stamford Bridge had witnessed the end of an era, though nobody quite realized it yet. This wasn't just another battle. This was the finale of the Viking Age. For 250 years, Vikings had raided England with near impunity. They had conquered the Danelaw, ruled York and East Anglia, extracted tribute from English kings, shaped English culture and bloodlines. They seemed like a permanent fixture of English life, a threat that could be managed but never eliminated. English strategy had been survival and adaptation, not victory. But at Stamford Bridge, England didn't just win a battle. England broke the Vikings completely. The survivors who sailed home to Norway with their impossible casualty reports convinced a generation of Norsemen that England was no longer worth the cost. No major Viking invasion would threaten England again. The age of Viking conquest was over. Harald Hardrada's death resonated across Scandinavia. He had been the last of the great Viking warrior kings, a living link to the legendary past when Norsemen conquered from Russia to the Mediterranean. His death marked the end of an era as surely as any date could. Future Norwegian kings would be administrators and politicians, not Viking raiders. The culture that had produced Harald, that valued warrior prowess above all else, was giving way to medieval feudalism and Christianity. Stamford Bridge was the sunset of that pagan warrior culture. The Viking Age didn't end because Vikings stopped existing. It ended because Vikings stopped being Vikings, stopped raiding and conquering, became medieval Scandinavians instead. And it ended at Stamford Bridge. But Harold Godwinson's brilliant victory came with a terrible price that would be paid in 3 weeks. His army was exhausted, depleted of its best warriors, scattered across northern England, recovering from the battle. On September 28th, just 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy landed on the southern coast with his invasion force. Harold received the news while still in York, probably while still counting his Viking dead. He had to force march his exhausted army 200 miles back south to face a fresh, prepared enemy. The same soldiers who had marched to York and fought at Stamford Bridge would have to march back and fight again. The housecarls who survived the Vikings would die fighting Normans at Hastings. Harold's speed and aggression had won at Stamford Bridge, but left him fatally weakened for Hastings. The legend of the bridge defender spread across Europe in the years after the battle. Medieval chroniclers in England and Scandinavia both recorded the story of the unnamed Viking who held the bridge alone, who killed 40 men, who bought his army precious time with his life. He became a symbol of Viking courage and the warrior ideal. His death, speared from below through the bridge by an unseen enemy, added complexity to the legend. He had fought bravely and honorably from the front, while his killer struck from hiding. But war isn't about honor. War is about winning by any means necessary. The English won not through greater bravery, but through better tactics. The bridge defender died a hero, but his heroism couldn't save his army from annihilation. The Battle of Stamford Bridge marked the end of the Viking Age, but it also marked the end of Anglo-Saxon England. Harold's victory over the Vikings led directly to his defeat by the Normans. If he hadn't marched north, if he had let Harald Hardrada take York and waited for William in the south with a fresh army, English history might have been completely different. But Harold chose to fight both invasions, won the first and lost the second, and Anglo-Saxon England died with him at Hastings. The year 1066 saw the end of 2 ages in one brutal autumn. The Viking Age ended at Stamford Bridge in September, and Anglo-Saxon England ended at Hastings in October. Both battles shaped the future of Britain, but history remembers Hastings and forgets Stamford Bridge. England's victory at Stamford Bridge proved that Vikings could be beaten decisively, that English armies could march faster and hit harder than Norse invaders expected. The forced march, the surprise attack, the willingness to fight immediately rather than negotiate, all of it showed an English military competence that Vikings hadn't faced before. Harold Godwinson demonstrated that English kings didn't have to pay Danegeld anymore, didn't have to accept Viking raids as inevitable. But he also demonstrated the limits of that competence. You can win brilliantly against one invasion and still lose to another. You can be a tactical genius and a strategic failure. Harold saved England from the Vikings, but lost England to the Normans. History is cruel that way. After 250 years of raiding England, 6,000 Vikings met their end in a single afternoon at Stamford Bridge. The greatest Viking warrior of his generation died from an arrow in an English field. The legendary bridge defender died from a spear thrust through bridge planks. An entire invasion force was annihilated so thoroughly that 300 ships became 24. The Viking Age ended not with a gradual fade, but with sudden catastrophic violence, with English soldiers finally saying enough and backing it up with overwhelming force. The bridge ran red with English blood in the morning and Viking blood in the afternoon. The fields were carpeted with Viking dead by evening. And when it was over, when the survivors sailed home to Norway with their tales of disaster, no one wanted to raid England anymore. The 250-year nightmare was finally over, ended in 6 hours of brutal combat at a wooden bridge in northern England that most people had never heard of and would quickly forget.